At the time of recording this episode, I, as a type 1 diabetic, completed my very first full distance Ironman race exactly a week ago and collected this beautiful medal and t-shirt and hats and jackets and a lot of stuff. I bought all of the merchandise to commemorate this event because it was a big deal. And a lot of you actually asked about how that was possible for a type 1 diabetic. So I thought I'd make an episode here and share the details of how it was possible. The diabetes dosing decisions that I made, the ins and outs of the blood sugars, the impacts of adrenaline, issues that I ran into with my diabetes technology, all sorts of stuff that happened in the 13 hours and 43 minutes that it took me to traverse 140.6 miles through swimming, biking, and running. So today's episode is going to be very detail rich. If that's something that you're interested in, stick around. I will walk through to the best of my ability of my memory, all of the details of my full Ironman race as somebody living with type 1 diabetes. Now, if you don't know who I am, my name is Matt Vandevecht. I am also a certified master fitness trainer and nutritionist living with type 1 diabetes, and I experiment on my blood sugars so that I can report to you and, of course, my clients the lessons learned in hopes that they can help you to shortcut some of the frustrating pieces of diabetes, because it's hard a lot of the time. Let's jump right in, shall we? So heading into the race week, there are complications as a diabetic you already run into before the race even starts, and that is that as you're increasing your training volume to get used to riding 100 miles on a bike or a marathon distance for a run or swimming 2.5 miles, right? You have to assume there's going to be a difference of insulin needs. So leading up to the race, your insulin sensitivity changes quite a bit. My insulin needs stayed relatively similar, but it's because I use what's called the 80-20 blood sugar formula. Now, if you're unfamiliar with that, probably means that you might be new here, and that's fine. It's completely different. It's counterintuitive than what we were taught in the doctor's office, and it's actually what I teach my clients. It's something that took me a long time to figure out on my own. And it enables us to predict where blood sugars are going to go. So I was able to manipulate my insulin sensitivity so that I didn't have a bunch of lows, because personally I hate low blood sugars. You too, maybe? Yeah, lows suck. So in order to avoid low blood sugars, I decided I wanted to offset my insulin sensitivity with a little bit of insulin resistance so that overall my basal and insulin to carb ratios remained relatively stable throughout my training. The one thing that did change at times was my pre-bolus, or the timing of my insulin for my meals, on big training days where I'd be out riding my bike and going for runs for like 10, 11 hours plus, right? So that was the big difference in training. But the week before the race is called a taper, or a reduction in the overall training volume, so that you're fresh going into the race. So all of your training gets cut in half, if not more. So instead of going out for a 10-hour bike ride and run, I would go out for 4 or 5 hours, which felt like nothing for me. I was like, where's the rest of the workout, right? Which is insane. I know. I recognize that's crazy talk, because even a year ago, never would have dreamed that I would be doing an Ironman. That's wild. Honestly, it was a series of me just saying yes to challenges, and here we are. I am an Ironman now. So the power of yes, that's a very real thing. But leading into the race day, that taper week did throw me off quite a bit. Was able to still maintain time and range, but I was throwing enormous amounts of insulin at my meals just to stay in range. In some cases, double or even triple the insulin that I needed. Well, triple was once. For the most part, it was double. And that was shocking, but also expected. I cut my exercise down significantly, and as a result, my insulin sensitivity dropped significantly. So that was challenging. Going into race day, well, the couple days before, travel, that's never easy, but that's a whole thing. But race day, I anticipated a lot of the challenges, thankfully, from previous half Ironman events. So this is my first full distance Ironman, but I've done half Ironman races in the past. And I knew that adrenaline and stress were going to play a pretty big role in this. And so in practice, my blood sugars behave completely different than they do on a race day. So I actually did something that you're not supposed to do, which is tried something new on race day. So I hire multiple coaches. And if you guys have been sticking around for a while, you know, my shortcut in life is to hire coaches. I'm like, if somebody's done the thing that I want to do and they're an expert in that, I'll just pay them to give me all the answers, right? And that's the same thing a lot of people use me for with blood sugar formulas. Now, one thing that my coach told me was, or one of my coaches told me, the one who's a specialist with type 1 diabetes, mentioned that race day, your plan cannot be the same as a practice day because of stress, adrenaline, all of these things going on in the picture. So he's like, your dosing has to change, and it's going to seem counterintuitive. And I was like, yes, this seems like it's going to kill me. So I half followed his plan. And so he had me doing a full morning routine, and I was like, I just don't want to switch that many things up on race day. But I did give a little bit of insulin. And for me, I hate the idea of insulin on board when swimming, because as you can imagine, you don't have your cell phone when you're swimming. And so I have no way to check my blood sugar. So I don't know if I'm going low or not. And so that spooked me. So I went a little bit light on the insulin going into the swim. Well, I'll start here. I woke up, I was like 105. Beautiful. Love it. I think it was like 4:45, 4:30, something like that in the morning. And knew I had some room for some food, but not a whole lot, because I want blood sugars that are slightly elevated. So I enter into the swim at like 150, let's say. But I also knew stress was going to play a role in that. So based on the blood sugar formula that I teach, I know what's called a GTR, or your glucose tolerance ratio. That's what we teach our clients as well. I know how many carbs I can eat if I want to go from 105 to 150. So I did a quick calculation, was able to get about 9 or 10 carbs in, and took a little bit of insulin for the stress on top of that, and blood sugars ended perfectly at 150, as expected. It's like, sweet, this is awesome. So I went down to transition, which is where you put your bike and your run stuff, because after you swim, you have to bike, and then after you bike, you have to run. It's a very long day. But I went down, and we're getting all of our bags set up so that later in the day, it's really easy just to grab your stuff and go. And during that process, stress started kicking in a little bit. It got real, right? I knew the day ahead of me was finally here with the Ironman race. And so I watched my blood sugars go from 150 to 160 to 170 to 180. I was like, oh no. So I knew insulin on board plus exercise can bring blood sugars down. So I'm chugging water. I'm doing warm-up laps. I'm jogging around, stretching, doing yoga. I'm like, please, God, let my blood sugars stay where they need to be. Because at my last race, blood sugars went over 200 before the race even started, because I was so stressed out. So good news is it stopped right at 180, and it hovered between 175 and 180 the whole pre-swim time. And the reason that's great is that the swim, sometimes it takes like 30 plus minutes for you to get to your turn, right? Because they've got 3,000 athletes there, and they only send out 4 athletes every 5 seconds. So you can imagine we're all just standing there in our nerves, waiting. And so thankfully blood sugars did cooperate, kept them right there. Right before the swim, I actually have an RX bar, which is about 23 or 24 grams of carbs. It's got some fats and proteins in there. That's my choice because I'm starving by that point. Basically skip breakfast, right? Not ideal, but that's just what I've been training with. Everything aside, the fact that I basically skipped breakfast and still did an Ironman, that's insane. So yeah, started the day in a calorie deficit. Not wise, but it worked. But the RX bar, it's slow enough digesting where I don't take insulin for it, because by the time it starts digesting, I'm already a third of the way into my swim, and I'm swimming 2.4 miles, right? So I need fuel because I need to offset the glucose burn from the swim. Exercise burns glucose, right? You're burning energy to move. So it makes sense. It balances out. And then my pump is disconnected this whole time. So there's no insulin going in for basal or for bolus. So that does mean that when I got out of the water, I need to make up for some of that insulin that was missing, right? For the food, for the basal. So I got out, blood sugars right at 175. Oh, baby. It was perfectly stable the entire swim, and technically in range. Not the most beautiful in range number, but it worked, right? So very excited about that. Took the insulin that I calculated that I needed. And at this point, for me, it was because I was a little elevated. I also needed to cover basal. I was trying to get food in, all these different pieces of the puzzle, stress, adrenaline. I was also hypothermic coming out of the water. So I was violently shaking. It was very cold. That just adds a whole other level of complexity to the situation. When I'm cold, circulation slows. I tend to run higher anyway. So I had to calculate that in there. Long story short, ended up given 2.4 units. Now, that I don't want you to pay too much attention to, and I'm not going to give a lot of specifics on insulin beyond this because ultimately all of us have very different insulin needs, right? So 2.4 units for me was like, oh geez, that's a lot, right? And then for somebody else, they might be like, that's enough insulin to cover 10 carbs. That's nothing. It's totally different for everyone. But with that being said, I gave what to me was a lot of insulin. So whatever you think is a lot, that's what I gave. And so went out, I pre-bolused because I have to start eating on the bike. I have about 70 carbs per hour that I need to consume. This bike ride is about 6 to 7 hours. So that's a lot of carbs, right? So I need some insulin to get that going. And unfortunately, the insulin didn't work, like at all. I took my first glucose gel and nothing happened. In fact, here we go. This is actually my race bag from race days. These are glucose gels or goos, right? Each of these has like 22, 23 grams of carbs. They've got amino acids, caffeine, sodium, so electrolytes, all the stuff you need. I took one, which is 22 grams of carbs. And granted, I covered enough insulin to take in like 70 plus carbs. So 22 carbs spikes me with all that insulin, plus exercise, plus hydration. I'm like, what? This is not right. So long story short, I make the decision to add a little extra, right? And I'm like, okay, just a tiny bit more insulin. I give it, I wait another 10 minutes thinking I'm going to be plummeting any second. Every 5 minutes, I'm checking my insulin pump because, oh, by the way, my watch stopped displaying my Dexcom readings at this point. So I had no CGM readings. It's like, awesome. So using my insulin pump as my guide, checking it every 5 minutes, like, okay, one of these times it's going to say double arrows down, right? And I'm going to have to just chug everything I have. No, stayed right where it was, over 200. I'm like, oh, that's unfortunate. A little more insulin. Oh, no, still there. A little more insulin. At this point, as you can imagine, this is basically stacking insulin, right? And I am calculating everything. Very well thought out, I will say. In what I've covered in my previous episode from last week was this formula for awareness, action, and emergency exit. So every one of these actions that I take, I have an emergency exit. I'm calculating, okay, this much insulin given would require, like, let's just say it was too much, right? If I gave half of a unit. If that half a unit was too much, I know how long I have to turn my pump off in order to offset that risk, or how many carbs to consume to offset that drop. Or, if I needed to, I could stop the race, sit on the side of the road, and just chug sugar, right? So that I take exercise out of the equation. So I'm constantly thinking through these processes like, okay, what is the worst case scenario? And do I have an emergency exit for that? So every time I'm given insulin, I'm calculating, okay, how much insulin is left on board from previous doses? How much am I adding? How can I cancel it out if I need to, if this is too much? And I'm doing so in micro doses. I'm not giving large amounts of insulin, but through these corrections, nothing is working. I'm like, okay, at this point in the race, if I do not eat an enormous amount of food very soon, the rest of the race is shot. Like scientifically, your body cannot carry you through a 13, 14-hour day of strenuous activity without proper food. Like you need nutrition to get through that. You'll cramp up, your joints are going to fail. Like it's just a nightmare. So I knew it's time for kind of a Hail Mary kind of a play, right? Like all or nothing, this has to work. And told my wife about this afterwards because she was nervous, rightfully so, for a type 1 to do an Ironman. Told her, I was like, hey, there was a couple points in the race like this one where I had to make a decision of if I do this, which I need to do it, either it works and I cross the finish line, or it doesn't work and I end up in the hospital. Like, that's how aggressive some of these dosing decisions were. And I'm watching the insulin on board stack up. At this point, I think I must have had like 3 or 4 active units of insulin on board. I made the choice to remove my temporary basal reduction because I had a significant reduction of insulin, because you're supposed to be more insulin sensitive, right? Like, what's going on? I bumped it up to triple what it was supposed to be. So the plan was to have insulin at a specific rate. I had to triple that on top of having a ton of insulin on board. And beyond that, after I tripled the basal, I continued to give more microboluses of insulin. So we're at this point, it's just kind of a ridiculous thing in my head. Like, I was able to get one more of those goo things in my mouth, and it stayed exactly where it was at. I'm like, how the heck is this not working, right? And just prime example of how diabetes doesn't always follow the rules. But what I want you to take home first is that diabetes was following the rules. I just wasn't aware of all of the rules, right? So you might experience blood sugars that seemingly don't make sense, but I can promise you they make sense. You just don't know what you don't know, right? We're ignorant of some of the variables. So I'm thinking through in my head, like, what else could lead into these blood sugars? Okay, hypothermia, check. That makes blood sugars run higher for me. Stress, adrenaline, sure, those also lead to higher blood sugars, but it's just not working. What's going on? And then immediately I thought back to the swim, and I was like, wait, somebody kicked my insulin site. What if they like knocked it out, or if there's inflammation from the needle or whatever? Like, oh, that could be it. So now I'm thinking I need to change my pump site, right? So I made a decision to do one more larger dose of insulin. I was like, all right, if this doesn't work, I have to stop at the next aid station at the medical tent and change my site, because clearly something's wrong. It's not working. And gave it, and 5 minutes later, I was like, all right, time to check, like, see what's going on. And boom, finally, blood sugars are coming down. I was like, oh, thank God. Take a goo, back on track, and I'm back on my feeding schedule. So every 20 minutes, more food, 20 minutes, more food, 10 minutes, more food. I'm looking at blood sugars, and I'm like every 10, maybe less than 10 minutes, I need to eat food, because now it's dropping. Now it's really dropping. And I had to battle back and forth between more food, but not too much, because if you eat too much at once, you get sick, and then the whole race is canned as well. So now I'm playing with the emergency exit plans of shutting my pump off entirely, right? Because it's drop. Like, I can't eat fast enough to fix this. Shut the pump off. Let's remove some insulin. And then it would balance out and then start to creep back up because I took in sugar. Okay, turn the pump back on, 100% basal, oh, too much, 50% basal. And the rest of the bike ride was just me toying with all these different calculations in my head. It was complicated, right? But after initially getting it down from that 200, I think it was like 208 maybe was the highest it got. But once I got it down below 200 and had all that insulin on board running, I was able to stay 100% time and range for the rest of the bike. So that felt great. Stayed right around 135, and that was the marker I kept it at for the whole distance. Got all my food in. Actually did end up having to consume more food than I've trained with, which came back to bite me in the butt during the marathon section. So I trained with probably 50 to 70 carbs per hour. And a common thing in the Ironman world is if you haven't trained with something, especially in the food realm, if you haven't trained with more food, your stomach can fight you on that. It's just not used to digesting that much food while you're active. So considering I think I probably was at around 80 carbs per hour that I had to consume, my stomach was very full. And with a full stomach heading into run a marathon was less than ideal. So I for the 45 minutes, the last 45 minutes of my bike ride, I shut my pump off completely, knowing that I needed to slow down my eating or I was going to get sick. So shut it off completely. It stayed at 135. And because I was still exercising but not consuming sugar, it balanced out perfectly at that point, right? By the way, none of this is medical advice. Definitely should have said that in the beginning. Consult with your doctors if you want to make any adjustments to your insulin. Don't listen to me. This is just personal experience. But shut my pump off completely, about 45 minutes heading into the run, and then resumed insulin at the beginning of the run because I need to continue fueling with sugar at that point. So got in, still 135, feeling great about it, feeling excited because now I've got the swim done, the bike is done, and I'm heading into the final segment, which is like, hey, you're almost done. No, not almost done. I had hell in front of me. Oh my gosh. and at this point, I didn't know that. I was feeling confident. I was borderline cocky. I was like, Ironman's easy. This is a walk in the park. You know, we just had a nice bike ride. It was beautiful. Now we're gonna go for a jog through the park. So for the first 8 miles of the marathon, I'm taking in my glucose, my electrolytes, my caffeine, feeling awesome. Everything is back on track. I'm like, praise God, this is how it's supposed to be when the plan goes right. And then that did happen. It felt great until the plan was no longer going right. 8 miles in, my stomach flipped and fought me. And I recognized it instantly. I knew I couldn't take in anything else, not even water. So my stomach was so full, and I hadn't trained with it before, that it just flipped a switch and would not take in anything else. And when I say not take in, I mean I felt so nauseous at even the thought of putting something in my mouth, like gum even. I was like, no, nothing goes in my mouth, that I had to completely shift the strategy. So as a diabetic, knowing that I might throw up and I'm trying to run a marathon at the back end of an Ironman, that presents a new challenge, because if I throw up and lose the sugar that I'm trying to digest to keep me from going low, I'm going to go low and not be able to fix it. Because if I try to eat sugar and I throw it back up, there's no way to effectively treat a low blood sugar. So this is quite this serious situation. So I recognized this, immediately turned off my pump completely, because I was still at 135. Mind you, I'm, what is it, a quarter-ish, a third almost of the way through a marathon, and blood sugars have stayed exactly at 135 the whole time. I was very happy with that. It's like, yeah, blood sugar formulas work, baby. So I was all proud about that. But my stomach flipping obviously flipped the plan. So shut my pump off completely, couldn't take in any food. Mind you, they've got some delicious stuff on course for marathon runners. And at the end of an Ironman, they have extra special snacks. They've got potato chips, grapes. After it got dark, they brought out chicken broth, which sounds gross, but I promise you it was magical. Never knew that would be so good. Obviously, water, oranges, bananas, electrolytes, Coca-Cola, like the spread, right? So that's the good news. There's plenty of options. I just couldn't eat any of it. So for a couple of miles, I was unfortunately reduced to walking. The bouncing from running made me even sicker. So I had to walk so that I wouldn't throw up until I felt good enough to jog. I would jog half a mile, feel sick again, had to walk. And I hated it because fitness-wise, I knew I could go faster. As an athlete, being held back by my stomach was one of the most frustrating things, because I was fit enough to run a sub-4 marathon, but I wasn't going to get that today or that day, right? So actually ran into my family, and my mom saw me walk and was like, what's wrong? She's like, why are you walking, right? It's a race. And I was like, my stomach's fighting me. I can't take in food or water. I'm in a bad spot. And so she was like, we'll pray for you. She sent out a text blast. And for you guys who followed for a long time, myself and my whole family, we're all Christian. So faith plays a big part in my journey with this as well. So I'm just saying prayers the whole time, like, God, please help me finish the race, right? Like, I know I'm not going to make this amazing PR right now. I need to finish the race. Please keep me safe, right? And safety was a big issue. And I'm going to speak to what I believe was a miracle or an answer to prayer 2 minutes after my mom started praying for me and texted all of her friends and said, pray for Matt. I felt better. I was like, I think I can take in more food. I'm going to try. So blood sugars are still sitting at like 150, 140. And I'm like, what the heck? It's beautiful, but I'm struggling. So decided to try the chicken broth thing. And the chicken broth was a godsend. I mean, they joked about it beforehand. They're like, you're going to love chicken broth. I literally have like 5 cartons of chicken broth in the fridge now because I'm just hooked on it. Like, it's got this positive memory of like, that's the thing that my stomach accepted, you know. But I had chicken broth, the stomach started feeling better as well with that. Started playing with bananas. And so for the second half of the marathon, blood sugars, because I had my pump turned off for about an hour and a half, which is a lot. I do not recommend that. That was an emergency situation where I decided, hey, the only way I get through this is without insulin. I'm going to have to force blood sugars to go up, because if I throw up, I'm going to have to exit the race, right? And that's not okay. If I go low, I'm going to have to exit the race because I can't take food in. So made the decision to sacrifice perfect blood sugars in order to complete the race. And the walking was necessary as well, unfortunately, but you do what you got to do. It was during this time that we had some pretty dark thoughts, some pretty dark moments, not going to lie. It was very difficult. My body felt like it was shutting down, not just my stomach now, but the rest of my body, because I was unable to take in enough food to replenish my glycogen stores. And so my body's running on empty. I feel sick, and it was a hard moment. Many moments, actually. But through very careful experimentation on what foods worked, which ones didn't, I was able, this is going to sound kind of funny, I think I calculated it out to about 10 bananas. I was able to consume 10 bananas through just 1 bite, chuck the rest. The next aid station, 2 bites, chuck the rest. You know, so about 10 bananas later, lots of chicken broth, no more gels. I couldn't handle any of the stuff that I was eating before. Was able to keep blood sugars in the higher range, but still keep going. And that was the key, right? So blood sugars eventually, every time that they would creep up a little bit, I would resume insulin. Because here's a little known fact, if you are without insulin for too long, you can run into what's called euglycemic DKA. So DKA is diabetic ketoacidosis. It's your blood turns acidic. It's a lack of insulin in the blood, or lack of appropriate insulin in the blood, and it can be a pretty serious thing that can hospitalize you and or kill you. So I know if I am without insulin for too long, I run the risk of DKA. I had to go without insulin for short periods of time to keep me in the race, but I'm also toying this balance of like, don't go low, but also don't go into DKA. I'm running out of options because my body is shutting down. So I had to make the choice that every time it crept up, I would turn my pump on for anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes. And because I was so insulin sensitive by that time in the race, keep in mind, this is like 12 hours into an endurance race, right? I was so insulin sensitive that keeping my pump on for like 5 to 10 minutes would push my blood sugars back down within 5 to 10 minutes. It was wild. So I am so incredibly sensitive to insulin, and I know this, that any amount of insulin is going to push me down. So quick, turn it back off, right? Can't go low, remember, because I might throw up. So I'm just balancing all these different variables and still trying to maintain proper electrolyte balance, sodium, potassium, magnesium, taking considerations of caffeine. Like, I need to make sure I finish this race. What do I have to do to get there? Amino acids need to be replenished because muscle breakdown is absolutely happening by this point. So I've got probably 6 different calculations in my head in addition to blood sugars. It's a complicated thing, these endurance sports, or I guess technically ultra endurance sports, right? But we got towards the end, and stomach was starting to feel good enough to start getting the bare minimum of calories in. So I was able to maintain that current state that I was in, which was not a pleasant state. My whole body was on the verge of breakdown, with cramps and joint issues and just everything almost falling apart, but not quite there, right? So I was just stuck in like this pain purgatory and still feeling nauseous, but able to complete it. So we get to the end, and blood sugars are sitting right around 200. And I said, you know, that's fine. I don't even care. I finished it. I am an Ironman, right? And made that sacrifice, and knowing full well that I was toeing the line a few times with some dangerous situations, right? First, the big risk of going low with large doses of insulin on the bike. Then second, shutting my pump off for an hour and a half plus and getting basically no insulin throughout the run. I was at risk of going into DKA. Euglycemic DKA, by the way, I didn't define that one, is going into DKA with normal blood sugars. That's what euglycemic means. Normal blood sugar, DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis, to where if you're exercising and burning glucose, you can see blood sugars that are stable and in range. But if you shut your pump off as the only strategy for too long, you run the risk of going into DKA and not even knowing it because you're sitting at 120. You're like, my blood sugars are perfect. Why am I vomiting, right? So that's a very dangerous strategy. I know a lot of people are taught, if you're going to exercise, just turn your insulin pump off. It's like, that doesn't really work for longer term stuff. It might work for a quick 30-minute workout, but I still don't really recommend that as a strategy. So a lot to consider, but I wanted to give you guys the real blood sugar race report. We'll call it DIRT, diabetes in real time. I feel like I've heard that somewhere. But that's what it was, right? It's just a race report going through blood sugars. End of the race, 200, and my pump had been on and off, mostly off for the last couple of hours. And so I knew I needed to resume insulin, but I also knew I am hypersensitive to insulin. So I didn't know how much insulin to give, what my basal rates should be. The calculations were all thrown to pieces because of all the new factors at play, right? And I still felt kind of nauseous. My family, told them I was like, I want a number 7 in a tub from Jersey Mike's at the end of the race. So they made a special effort to get that to me. It's turkey and provolone with like lettuce and tomatoes and stuff. It's very low carb, high protein, high fat. I just like scarfing it down and not having to worry about bolusing for it. But they were like, hey, you want your food? And instantly I was just like, no, don't even talk about food. Like, just the word food almost made me throw up. That's how sensitive it was. But unfortunately, at the end of the race, blood sugars did not cooperate. You're starving and very tired. And I finished the race, I think it was like 9 o'clock at night or something. Keep in mind, we started before the sun came up and we finished after the sun went down. That's a whole journey of its own. But blood sugars stayed at 200. We're walking around the finish line, enjoying everything. I'm trying to be present and not really worry too much about the blood sugars. But we get back to the hotel and blood sugars are sitting now at like 220, 230. And I'm like, really? I've been running my basal. I thought for sure they would plummet at this point, and that correction factor's got to be through the roof. And had the Jersey Mike's because I was starving, and blood sugars went to 250. I'm like, oh no, what's happening? So I gave just a little bit of insulin. I'm like, okay, that should be enough to drop me like 300 points by itself. I'm gonna have to drink juice. Nothing happened. And I'm like, this again? I had to deal with this like 15 hours ago. A little more insulin. Nothing happened. I'm like, goodness gracious, I don't want to go low, but like, I need to get this down. So I gave a little bit more. Nothing happened. I'm like, well, at the very least, it's not getting worse, right? I'm sitting at 250. I do a finger stick. I'm 312. Man, that just kind of hurts to admit, even, because I'm like, I'm the diabetic coach, people look to me for guidance and I'm sitting at 312. So part of me is like, well, you did this to yourself. You accepted you'd have to sit at higher blood sugars to get through that nausea phase where you're hyper insulin sensitive and also might throw up. So you did what you needed to do to finish the race, but dang, right? So again, still not knowing what my true correction factor is because all the variables just got mixed and muddied toward the end of the race. Gave my best guess at a correction using, again, the 80-20 blood sugar formula that I always talk about here. And I was like, you know what? Trust the formula. It's a scary amount of insulin right now because of, what you've seen a 1/10 of a unit do, but gave a large amount of insulin. That is what the formula said I needed based on the activity, based on the food consumed, based on surrounding variables like stress, adrenaline, celebration, time of day, missing basal insulin, all that stuff. So these are things that I show my clients how to do, how to calculate. The reality is that you've been using blood sugar formulas all along, but they've been incomplete, right? And with an incomplete formula, you never have certainty behind it. So I was like, all right, let's just practice what I preach. We're going to use the 80-20 blood sugar formula. Oh, it feels risky, but we're going to give that insulin. Let's give it a go. And by this point, it was, I think, 1:30 in the morning. And I'm like, I have to get it down. I'm so exhausted that it works, or I go to bed and just let it sit at 300 all night, right? Like, this is the last attempt. So I was like, okay, blood sugar formula, here we go. And gave it, used one of my accelerators, which if you guys know me, you know what that means. Basically, there's ways you can make insulin work faster. It doesn't make it go further, just makes it work faster, because insulin takes forever to work, right? So in the formula, I used an accelerator and was like, okay, get a juice box on standby, right? Watched it go from 312, drum roll please, all the way down, double arrows down, to a smooth landing at 105. Sigh of relief. I felt so grateful that I could go to bed. At this point, it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm just like borderline tears of joy. Like, yes, I am an Ironman, woohoo, but I'm tired. I want to go to bed, right? And so 3 o'clock in the morning, finally able to go to sleep. Blood sugar's 105, stayed consistent between 80 and 105 the entire night. With my other calculations at play, and was able to finally rest. Now, quick post-race report, because I know we've been spending a lot of time on this. Post-race, blood sugars were crazy responsive to insulin. Finally, the stress is gone and the insulin resistance is gone. Inflammation still there, but not as present, right? I was actually able to consume, I think it was like 60 or 70 carbs uncovered for breakfast. And at lunch, I didn't dose for like 20 or 30 carbs. Dinner, same thing. The next day, I ate 50 carbs for breakfast. Didn't take a lick of extra insulin. It was amazing. And I was still running my basal rates. So what I made the decision to do was calculate how much insulin reduction was needed for foods, right? And I chose to go basal heavy. So what I was doing was feeding an excess of basal insulin and not needing to bolus for anything. So that was wicked fun, because without having to bolus, it meant I would just eat when I was hungry. And I honestly felt like I didn't have diabetes for a couple of days. I was like, this is so cool. You know, I went out to breakfast, ordered whatever I wanted, was like, that looks good. I'm just going to start eating right now. No pre-bolus, no bolus. I mean, first of all, if you guys are here in the comments, just imagine what that would feel like to not have to worry about bolusing, to not have to worry about timing your insulin, to just dive into the food the second it gets in front of you, and you got that food, not because it was easy to dose for, but because it looked good, right? That freedom. Oh my gosh. It's beautiful. And this is actually what I talk to a lot of my clients about. Like, that's also what it feels like to have your blood sugar formulas set up. Like, when you're done, when my clients are done going through our programs, that's the end goal, is to have your formulas so concrete that you're like, I can order whatever I want and eat it and enjoy it, right? You still have to take your insulin, you still have to pre-bolus, but to have the confidence, the certainty to get what you want and just enjoy food, right? So I had a couple of days where I got to pretend I wasn't diabetic and was like, this is awesome. And thankfully, I knew how to adjust, right? So I used the blood sugar formulas not just to have more fun, but also to protect me. Because had I not known how to make those adjustments, I for sure would have had urgent lows every single meal, because I would have dosed insulin for the food and not needed the extra insulin, right? That would be scary. So I'm very grateful for what blood sugar formulas enabled me to do. And truth be told, blood sugar formulas are one of the big things that carried me through that race. Being able to adapt, recalculate, and then recenter on a new strategy. That's the name of the game with diabetes, because every day is a new day. There are no repeats, right? Just like with the race day, completely different strategy than what I was used to in training, and I had to adapt. I mean, simply put, adapt or die. That was kind of my options. So anyways, that was it. I'm now back to standard. I've a week out, so I've had a week to recover. I feel fantastic and ready to pursue the next big thing. So hopefully this is helpful to see kind of how I thought through different processes. Hopefully it wasn't overwhelming. Again, not medical advice. These dosing decisions are really, that was the only time any of those have ever worked. I think I had 6 units of insulin during the bike ride that I haven't taken in the past. It was wild, but it all worked out. Praise God. and enabled me to pursue one of my wildest dreams, which is to become an Ironman while living with type 1 diabetes and to rock it. So I appreciate all of you for all your support. It's been a wild journey, just this whole process of getting things figured out. And for clarification, by the way, I don't coach like Ironman athletes. I mean, there's like 2 people who want to pursue Ironman now that they've seen me do it. Most of my clients are just trying to get back to normal with their life, where blood sugars are controlled so that they can live their best life, have more freedom and flexibility in their food choices, playing with their kids or their grandkids, focus more on their career, that sort of stuff. So if that's something that you think might be helpful and you like the idea of more certainty behind your blood sugars, like what I got from using the 80-20 blood sugar formula, there's a free training you can go check out. You might find it helpful. Take some notes, see if you can use some things and actually implement this week. You can go to diabetesinaction.com. So I'll link that up for you guys, but that's going to be the best place to go to get started on getting more control over the blood sugars so that they don't control you. And thanks for hanging out. Hope this was helpful for you. And my goodness, we can do just about anything with type 1 diabetes. It does require a little extra preparation, a little extra planning, and the skill of adaptation, but we can do it. So, blood sugar formulas, if you want a little help on that, go check out diabetesinaction.com. I'll see you over there. Thanks for hanging out, and keep up the fight.